Okay, great. Me too. All right, we're rolling. We are on Chapter 2, The Shadow of the Past of Lord of the Rings, and I'm reading Mr. Gandalf, and Joe is reading Smeagol and Deagol, and Juliet is reading... Oh, no, are you reading Mr. Frodo?
I'm Frodo. And you're also the narrator.
And narrating, and Sam at the end if we get to it. Let's see, where did we end up last time? At the end of Chapter 1, Frodo saw him to the door, that's Gandalf. He gave a final wave of his hand and walked off at a surprising pace. But Frodo thought the old wizard looked unusually bent, almost as if he were carrying a great weight. The evening was closing in, and his cloaked figure quickly vanished into twilight. Frodo did not see him again for a long time. Which means 15 years or something.
15 months. I poke around the back. Boromir has left Gondor. Because there's a timeline that tells you when everything is happening.
Yeah.
So
Boromir has left Gondor to do what? Is he looking for...
To go to Rivendell.
Oh. Interesting.
Yeah.
Chapter 2, The Shadow of the Past. The talk did not die down in 9 or even 99 days. The second disappearance of Mr. Bilbo Baggins was discussed in Hobbiton and indeed all over the Shire for a year and a day, and was remembered much longer than that. It became a fireside story for young hobbits, and eventually Mad Baggins, who used to vanish with a bang and a flash and reappear with bags of jewels and gold, became a favorite character of legend, and lived on long after all the true events were forgotten. That's so great. But in the meantime, the general opinion in the neighborhood was that Bilbo, who had always been rather cracked, had at last gone quite mad, and had run off into the blue. There he had undoubtedly fallen into a pool or a river, or come to a tragic but hardly untimely end. The blame was mostly laid on Gandalf.
If only that dratted wizard would leave young Frodo alone. Perhaps he'll settle down and grow some hobbit sense.
They said, thank you. And to all appearance the wizard did leave Frodo alone, and he did settle down, but the growth of hobbit sense was not very noticeable. Indeed, he at once began to carry on Bilbo's reputation for oddity. He refused to go into mourning, and the next year he gave a party in honor of Bilbo's 112th birthday, which he called the 100-weight feast. But that was short of the mark, for 20 guests were invited, and there were several meals at which it snowed food and rained drink, as hobbits say. Some people were rather shocked, but Frodo kept up the custom of giving Bilbo's birthday party year after year until they got used to it. He said that he did not think Bilbo was dead. When they asked, "Where is he then?" he shrugged his shoulders. He lived alone, as Bilbo had done, but he had a good many friends, especially among the younger hobbits, mostly descendants of the old Took, who had as children been fond of Bilbo, and often in and out of Bag End. Folko Boffin and Fredrigor Bolger were two of these, but his closest friends were Peregrine Took, usually called Pippin, and Merry Brandybuck. His real name was Meriadoc, but that was seldom remembered. Frodo went tramping all over the Shire with them, but more often he wandered by himself, and to the amazement of sensible folk he was sometimes seen far from home, walking in the hills and woods under the starlight. Merry and Pippin suspected that he visited elves at times, as Bilbo had done. As time went on, people began to notice that Frodo also showed signs of good preservation. Outwardly, he retained the appearance of a robust and energetic hobbit just out of his tweens.
Some folks have all the luck,
they said, but it was not until Frodo approached the usually more sober age of 50 that they began to think it queer. Frodo himself, after the first shock, found that being his own master and the Mr. Baggins of Bag End was rather pleasant. For some years he was quite happy and did not worry much about the future. But half unknown to himself, the regret that he had not gone with Bilbo was steadily growing. He found himself wondering at all times, especially in the autumn, about the wild lands, and strange visions of mountains that he had never seen came into his dreams. He began to say to himself,
"Perhaps I shall cross the river myself one day." To which the other half of his mind always replied, "Not yet."
Not yet. And so it went on, until his 40s were running out, and his 50th birthday was drawing near. 50 was a number that he felt was somehow significant or ominous. It was at any rate at that age that adventure had suddenly befallen Bilbo. Frodo began to feel restless, and the old path seemed too well trodden. He looked at maps and wondered what lay beyond their edges. Maps made in the Shire showed mostly white spaces beyond its borders. He took to wandering further afield, and more often by himself, and Merry and his other friends watched him anxiously. Often he was seen walking and talking with the strange wayfarers that began at this time to appear in the Shire. Strange wayfarers. There were rumors of strange things happening in the world outside, and as Gandalf had not at the time appeared or sent any messages for several years, Frodo gathered all the news he could. Elves, who seldom walked in the Shire, could now be seen passing westward through the woods in the evening. Oh, I've got to read that again. Elves, who seldom walked in the Shire, could now be seen passing westward through the woods in the evening, passing and not returning. But they were leaving Middle-earth, and were no longer concerned with its troubles. There were, however, dwarves on the road in unusual numbers. The ancient east-west road ran through the Shire to its end at the Grey Havens, and the dwarves had always used it on their way to their mines in the Blue Mountains. They were the hobbits' chief source of news from distant parts, if they wanted any, and as a rule dwarves said little, and hobbits asked no more. But now Frodo often met strange dwarves of far countries, seeking refuge in the west. They were troubled, and some spoke in whispers of the enemy and the land of Mordor. The name the hobbits knew only in legend, or that name the hobbits only knew in legends of the dark past, like a shadow in the background of their memories. But it was ominous and disquieting. It seemed that evil power in Mirkwood had been driven out by the White Council, only to reappear in greater strength in the old strongholds of Mordor. The Dark Tower had been rebuilt, it was said, and from there power was spreading far and wide, and away far east and south there were wars and growing fear. Orcs were multiplying again in the mountains. Trolls were abroad, no longer dull-witted, but cunning and armed with dreadful weapons. And there were murmured hints of creatures more terrible than all these, but they had no name. Little of all this, of course, reached the ears of ordinary hobbits, but even the deafest and most stay-at-home began to hear queer tales, and those whose business took them to the borders saw strange things. The conversation in the Green Dragon at Bywater, one evening in the spring of Frodo's 50th year, showed that even the most comfortable heart of the Shire rumours had been heard, though most hobbits still laughed at them. Sam Gamgee was sitting in the corner near the fire, and opposite him was Ted Sandyman, the miller's son, and there were various other rustic hobbits listening to their talk. I have to get my sleeping bag. I'm starting to get cold.
That's right.
One moment, please.
Yes, get a blanket.
Would one of you like to be any of these characters?
Joe wants to be Ted.
Pardon me?
I volunteered and Joe wants to be Ted. She wants to give a conversation with you.
And no, you are always Sam.
You are a very good Sam.
Oh, thank you. All right. I'll start as Sam. Queer things you do here these days, to be sure, said Sam.
Ah, said Ted. You do if you listen. I can hear fireside tales and children's stories at home if I want to.
Oh, no doubt you can, retorted Sam. I dare say there's more truth in some of them than you reckon. Who invented the stories, anyway? Take dragons, now.
No, thank you, said Ted. I won't. I heard tell of them when I was a youngster, but there's no call to believe in them now. There's only one dragon in Bywater, and that's green, he said, he's getting a general laugh.
All right, said Sam, laughing with the rest, but what about those tree men? Those giants, as you may call them? They do say that one bigger than a tree was seen away up beyond the North Moors not long back.
Who's they?
My cousin Hal, for one. He works for Mr. Boffin over at Overhill and goes up to the North Farthing for the hunting. He saw one.
Says he did, perhaps. You're always saying he's seen things, and maybe he sees things that ain't there.
But this one was big as an elm tree, and walking 7 yards to a stride if it was an inch.
Then I bet it wasn't an inch. What he saw was an elm tree, like as not.
But this one was walking, I tell you, and there ain't no elm tree on the North Moors.
And I can't have seen one, said Ted.
There was some laughing and clapping. The audience seemed to think that Ted had scored a point. All the same, said Sam, you can't deny that others beyond our half-fast have seen queer folk crossing the Shire. Crossing it, mind you, there have been more turned back at the borders. The bounder must have never been so busy before. And I've heard tell that elves are moving west. They do say that they are going to the harbours, away out beyond the White Towers. Sam waved his arm vaguely. He nor any of them knew how far it was to the sea, past the old towers beyond the western borders of the Shire. But it was an old tradition that away over there stood the grey havens, from which at times elven ships set sail, never to return. They're sailing, said Sam, sailing over the sea. They're going into the west and leaving us. Sam said, half chanting the words, shaking his head sadly and solemnly. But Ted laughed.
Well, that isn't anything new if you believe the old tales, and I don't see what it matters to me or you. Let them sail. I warrant you haven't seen them doing it, nor anyone else in the Shire.
Well, I don't know, said Sam thoughtfully. He believed he had once seen an elf in the woods, and still hoped to see more one day. Of all the legends that he had heard in his early years, such fragments of tales and half-remembered stories about elves as the hobbits knew had always moved him most deeply. There are some, even in these parts, as know the fair folk and get news of them, he said. There's Mr. Baggins now, that I work for. He told me they were sailing, and he knows a bit about elves, and old Mr. Bilbo knew more. Many's a talk I had with him when I was a little lad.
Oh, they're both cracked, said Ted. Leastways old Bilbo is cracked, and Frodo's cracking. But if that's where you get your news from, you'll never want for moonshine. Well, friend, I'm off home. Your good health. He drained his mug and went out noisily.
Sam sat silent and said no more. He had a good deal to think about. For one thing, there was a lot to do up in the Bag End garden, and he would have a busy day tomorrow, if the weather cleared. The grass was growing fast. But Sam had more on his mind than gardening. After a while he sighed and got up and went out. It was early April, and the sky was now clearing after heavy rain. The sun was down, and a cool, pale evening was quietly fading into night. He walked home under early stars, through Hobbiton and up the hill, whistling softly and thoughtfully. It was just at this time that Gandalf reappeared after his long absence. For 3 years after the party he had been away. Then he paid Frodo a brief visit, and after taking a good look at him, he went off again. During the next year or two he had turned up fairly often, coming unexpectedly after dusk and going off without warning before sunrise. He would not discuss his own business and journeys, and seemed chiefly interested in small news about Frodo's health and doings. Then suddenly his visit ceased. It was over 9 years since Frodo had seen or heard of him, and he had begun to think that the wizard would never return, and had given up all interest in hobbits. But that evening, as Sam was walking home and twilight was fading, there came the once familiar tap on the study window. Well, it's not quite a tap, but that's what I think Gandalf would sound like.
I think that's a Gandalf tap.
Frodo welcomed his old friend with great surprise and delight. They looked hard at one another. "All well, eh?" said Gandalf. "You look the same as ever, Frodo."
So do you, Frodo replied, but secretly he thought Gandalf looked older and more careworn.
He pressed him for news of himself and the wide world, and soon they were deep in talk, and they stayed up far into the night. Next morning, after a late breakfast, the wizard was sitting with Frodo by the open window of the study. A bright fire was on the hearth, but the sun was warm, and the wind was in the south. Everything looked fresh, and the new green of spring was shimmering in the fields and on the tips of the green trees' fingers. Alexa, play ambient noise. Springtime.
Welcome back to ambient noise. What should I play?
Springtime meadow.
Sorry, we don't have that yet. What else can I play?
Meadow. Oh, kind of a breezy meadow sound. Okay, I'll go.
Okay.
I'll live with it. A bright fire was on the hearth, but the sun was warm, and the wind was in the south. Everything looked fresh, and the new green of spring was shimmering in the fields and on the tips of the trees' fingers. Gandalf was thinking of a spring, nearly 80 years before, when Bilbo had ran out of Bag End without a handkerchief. 80 years. So it's the whole adult life of a hobbit, basically.
Mm-hmm.
Or more.
Mm-hmm. Especially if they don't grow to basically full adulthood until 30 and 50.
Yeah. His hair was perhaps whiter than it had been, and his beard and eyebrows were perhaps longer, and his face more lined with care and wisdom. But his eyes were as bright as ever, and he smoked and blew smoke rings with the same vigour and delight. He was smoking now in silence, for Frodo was sitting still, deep in thought. Even in the light of morning he felt the dark shadow of the tidings that Gandalf had brought. At last he broke the silence.
Last night you began to tell me strange things about my ring, Gandalf, he said, and then you stopped, because you said that much matters were best left until daylight. Don't you think you had better finish now? You say the ring's dangerous, far more dangerous than I guess. In what way?
"In many ways," answered the wizard. "It is far more powerful than I ever dared to think at first. So powerful that in the end it would utterly overcome anyone of mortal race who possessed it. It would possess him. In Eredgion, long years ago, many elven rings were made. Magic rings, as you call them, and they were, of course, of various kinds, some more potent and some less. The lesser rings were only essays in the craft, before it was full grown, and to the elven smith they were but trifles, yet still to my mind dangerous for mortals. But the great rings, the rings of power, now they were perilous. Immortal Frodo, who keeps one of the great rings, does not die. He does not grow or obtain more life. He merely continues, until at last every minute is a weariness. And if he often uses the ring to make himself invisible, he fades. He becomes in the end invisible permanently, and walks in the twilight under the eye of the dark power that rules the rings. Yes, sooner or later if he is strong or well-meaning to begin with, but neither strength nor good purpose will last. Sooner or later the dark power will devour him.
How terrifying, said Frodo. There was another long silence. The sounds of Sam Gamgee cutting the lawn came in from the garden. How long have you known this? Asked Frodo at length. And how much did Bilbo know?
Bilbo knew no more than he told you, I'm sure, said Gandalf. He would certainly never have passed on to you anything that he thought would be a danger, even though I promised to look after you. He thought that the ring was very beautiful and very useful at need, and if anything was wrong or queer, it was himself. He said that it was growing on his mind, and that he was always worrying about it. He did not suspect that the ring itself was to blame. Though he had found out that the thing needed looking after, it did not always seem of the same size or weight. It shrank or expanded in an odd way, and might suddenly slip off a finger where it had been tight.
Yes, he warned me of that in his last letter, said Frodo. So I've always kept it on its chain.
Very wise, said Gandalf. But as for his long life, Bilbo never connected it with the ring at all. He took all the credit for that himself, and he was very proud of it, though he was getting restless and uneasy. Thin and stretched, he had said, a sign that the ring was getting control.
How long have you known all of this? Asked Frodo again.
Known, said Gandalf. I have known much that only the wise know, Frodo. But if you mean known about this ring, well, I still do not know, one might say. There is a last test to make, but I no longer doubt my guess. When did I first begin to guess, he mused, searching back in memory. Let me see, it was in the year that the White Council drove the dark power from Mirkwood, just before the Battle of 5 Armies, that Bilbo found the ring. A shadow fell on my heart then, though I did not know yet what I feared. I wondered often how Gollum came by a great ring as plainly as it was. That at least was clear from the first. Then I heard Bilbo's strange story of how he had won it, and I could not believe it. When I at last got the truth out of him, I saw that he had been trying to put his claim to the ring beyond doubt. Much like Gollum with his birthday present, the lies were too much alike for my comfort. Clearly, the ring had an unwholesome power that set to work on its keeper at once. That was the first real warning that I had that not all was well. I told Bilbo often that such rings were better left unused, but he resented it and soon got angry. There was little else that I could do. I could not take it from him without doing great harm, and I had no right to do so anyway. I could only watch and wait. I might have perhaps consulted Saruman the White, but something always held me back from that.
Who is he? Asked Frodo. I've never heard of him before.
Maybe not, answered Gandalf. Hobbits are, or were, no concern of his. Yet he is great among the wise. He is the chief of my order, and the head of the council. His knowledge is deep, but his pride has grown with it, and takes ill any meddling. The lore of the elven rings, great and small, is his province. He has long studied it, seeking the lost secrets of their making. But when the rings were debated in the council, all that he would reveal to us of their ring lore was told against my fears. So my doubts slept, but uneasily. Still I watched and I waited.
So, all that he would reveal to us of his ring lore told against my fears. So he was strategically saying stuff about rings that made them not afraid. Got it.
Yeah. He might even have suspected, Gandalf is asking all these questions about the ring, and probably Saruman is trying to play it down, or, keep an eye on Gandalf, because wow, if he's got if he's tracking down one of the rings, Saruman wants to know about it.
I think so.
Still I watched, and I waited. All seemed well with Bilbo, and the years passed. Yes, they passed, and they seemed not to touch him. He showed no signs of age. The shadow fell on me again. But I said to myself, after all, he comes of a long-lived family on his mother's side. There is time yet. Wait. And I waited until that night when he left his house. He said and did things that then filled me with a fear that no words of Saruman could allay. At last I knew that something dark and deadly was at work, and I've spent most of the years since in finding out the truth of it.
There wasn't any permanent harm done, was there? Asked Frodo anxiously. He would get all right in time, wouldn't he? Be able to rest in peace, I mean.
He felt better at once, said Gandalf. But there is only one power in this world that knows all about the rings and their effects. And as far as I know, there is no power in the world that knows all about hobbits. Among the wise, I'm the only one that goes in for hobbit lore, an obscure branch of knowledge, but full of surprises. Soft as butter they can be, and yet sometimes as tough as old tree roots. I think it likely that some would resist the rings far longer than the most of the wise would believe. I don't think you need to worry about old Bilbo. Of course, he possessed the ring for many years and used it, so it might take a long while for the influence to wear off. Before it was safe for him to see it again, for instance. Otherwise, he might live on for years quite happily, just stop as he was when he parted with it. For he gave it up in the end of his own accord, an important point. No, I was not troubled about dear Bilbo any more once he had let the thing go. It is for you now that I feel responsible. Ever since Bilbo left, I've been deeply concerned about you, and about all these charming, absurd, helpless hobbits. It would be a grievous blow to the world if the dark power overcame the Shire, and if all of your kind, jolly, stupid Bolgers, Hornblowers, Boffins, Bracegirdles, and the rest, not to mention the ridiculous Bagginses, became enslaved.
Frodo shuddered. But why should we be? He asked. And why should he want such slaves?
To tell you the truth, replied Gandalf, I believe that hitherto, mark you, he has entirely overlooked the existence of hobbits, and you should be thankful. But your safety has passed. He does not need you. He has more useful servants, but he won't forget you again. And hobbits are as miserable slaves would please him far more than hobbits happy and free. There is such a thing as malice and revenge.
Revenge? Said Frodo. Revenge for what? I still don't understand what all this has to do with Bilbo. And myself. And our ring.
It has everything to do with it, said Gandalf. You do not know the real peril yet, but you shall. I was not sure of it myself when I last was here, but the time has come to speak. Give me the ring for a moment. Frodo took it from his breeches pocket, where it was clasped to a chain that hung from his belt. He unfastened it and handed it slowly to the wizard. It felt suddenly very heavy, as if either Frodo or Frodo himself was in some way reluctant, for Gandalf to touch it. Gandalf held it up. It looked to be made of pure and solid gold. Can you see any markings upon it? He asked.
No, said Frodo. There are none. It is quite plain, and it never shows a scratch or a sign of wear.
"Well then, look." And to Frodo's astonishment and distress, the wizard threw it suddenly into the middle of a glowing corner of the fire. Frodo gave a cry and groped for the tongs, but Gandalf held him back. "Wait," he said in a commanding tone, giving Frodo a quick look from under his bristling brows. No apparent change came over the ring. After a while, Gandalf got up and closed the shutters of the outside window and drew the curtains. The room became dark and silent, though the clack of Sam's shears, now nearer to the windows, could still be heard faintly from the garden. For a moment the wizard stood looking at the fire. Then he stooped and removed the ring to the hearth with the tongs, and at once picked it up. Frodo gasped. Pardon me, I'm yawning. Frodo gasped. "It is quite cool," said Gandalf. "Take it." Frodo received it on his shrinking palm, and it seemed to have become thicker and heavier than ever. "Hold it up," said Gandalf, "and look closely." And as Frodo did so, he now saw fine lines, finer than the finest pen strokes, running along the ring, outside and inside, lines of fire that seemed to form the letters of a glowing script. They shone piercingly bright and yet remote, as if out of a great depth. And there they are. Do you have the picture also?
Uh-huh.
Yes.
Oh my gosh.
Beautiful. "I cannot read the fiery letters," said Frodo in a quivering voice.
"No," said Gandalf, "but I can. The letters are Elvish, of an ancient mode, but the language is that of Mordor, which I will not utter here. But this in the common tongue is what is said, or close enough." Whew. That just put a shiver down my spine. "One ring to rule them all, one ring to find them, one ring to bring them all, and in the darkness bind them." Jeez, they're on to the one ring. It is only 2 lines of a verse long known in elven lore. 3 rings for the elven kings under the sky, 7 for the dwarf lords in their halls of stone, 9 for the mortal men doomed to die, 1 for the dark lord on his dark throne, in the land of Mordor where the shadows lie. 1 ring to rule them all, 1 ring to find them, 1 ring to bring them all, and in the darkness bind them in the land of Mordor where the shadows lie. He paused and then said slowly in a deep voice, "This is the master ring, the one ring to rule them all. This is the one ring that he lost many ages ago to the great weakening of his power. He greatly desires it, but he must not get it." Frodo sat silent and motionless. Fear seemed to stretch out a vast hand, like a dark cloud rising in the east and looming up to engulf him. "Wow."
"Ring?" he stammered. How on earth did it come to me?"
"Ah," said Gandalf, "that is a very long story. The beginnings lie back in the black years which only the lore masters remember now. If I were to tell you that tale, we would be sitting here when spring had passed into winter. But oh my God, am I reading I think I'm reading 10 pages. 1, 2... okay.
Also stops anytime you need to.
Thank you.
Deagol and Smeagol is on the next page on 52.
Yes, they're coming up, aren't they? Yeah. All right, we'll get to there, and then I'll turn it over to our Joe. And
do you want someone else to read for a bit?
No, I'll do it.
Okay.
This is so much fun.
You're doing excellent as Gandalf and the narrator.
Oh, thank you. It's fun. I'm right there. We're all right there in the room with them. Can you imagine how many millions of people have read this? How many billions of times people have been in their minds in this room with Gandalf and Frodo?
Quite a few.
Of all the hundreds of millions of people who've read it.
Mm-hmm.
And here we are with them. I can't believe it.
Our own time travel.
If I were to tell you that tale, we would be sitting here when spring had passed into winter. But last night I told you of Sauron the Great, the Dark Lord. The rumours that you have heard are true. He has indeed arisen again and left his hold in Mirkwood and returned to this ancient fastness in the Dark Tower of Mordor. The name that even you hobbits have heard of, like a shadow on the borders of old stories. Always after a defeat and a respite, the shadow takes another shape and grows again.
I wish it need not have happened in my time, said Frodo.
So do I, said Gandalf. So do all who live to see such times. But that is not for them to decide. All we have to decide is what to do with the time that is given to us. And already, Frodo, our time is beginning to look black. The enemy is fast becoming very strong. His plans are far from ripe, I think, but they are ripening. We shall be hard put to it. We shall be put very hard put to it, even if it were not for this dreadful chance. The enemy still lacks one thing to give him strength and knowledge to beat down all resistance, break the last defences, and cover all the lands in a second darkness. He lacks the one ring. The three fairest of all, the elf lords hid from him, and his hand never touched them nor sullied them. 7 the dwarf kings possessed, but 3 he has recovered, and the others the dragons have consumed. 9 he gave to mortal men, proud and great, and so ensnared them. Long ago they fell under the dominion of the One, and they became the ring wraiths, shadows under his great shadow, his most terrible servants. Long ago. It is many a year since the 9 walked abroad. Yet who knows? As the shadow grows once more, they too may walk again. But come, we will not speak of such evil things in the morning of the Shire. So it is now the 9 he has gathered to himself. The 7 also, or else they are destroyed. The 3 are hidden still, but that no longer troubles him. He needs only the 1, for he made that ring himself. It is his, and he let a great part of his own former power pass into it, so that he could rule all the others. If he recovers it, then he will command them all again. Wherever they may be, even the 3 and all that has been wrought with them will be laid bare, and he will be stronger than ever. Wow! A large part of Sauron is in that ring, in that room with them right there.
Grab it.
Well, we know.
Oh my God.
And this is the dreadful chance. Oh, nope. Sorry. It was just saying, Frodo. It's still you.
Oh, and this is the dreadful chance, Frodo. He believed that the One had perished, but the elves had destroyed it, as should have been done. But he knows that it has not perished, that it has been found. So he is seeking it, and all his thought is bent on it. It is his great hope and our great fear.
Why? Why wasn't it destroyed? Cried Frodo. And how did the enemy ever come to lose it? If he was so strong, and it was so precious to him? He clutched the ring in his hand, as if he already saw a dark figure stretching out to seize it.
It was taken from him, said Gandalf. The strength of elves to resist him was greater long ago, and not all men were estranged from them. The men of Westerness came to their aid. That is a chapter of ancient history, which it might be good to recall, for there was sorrow then too, and gathering dark, but great valour, and great deeds were not wholly vain. One day, perhaps, I will tell you all the tale, or you shall hear it told in full by one who knows it best. But for the moment, since most all of you need to know how this thing came to you, and that will be enough tale, this is all that I will say. It was Gil-galad, Elven King, and Elendil of Westerness who overthrew Sauron, though they themselves perished in the deed. And Isildur, Elendil's son, cut the ring from Sauron's hand and took it for his own. And then Sauron was vanquished, and his spirit fled and was hidden for long years until his shadow took shape again in Mirkwood. But the ring was lost. It fell into the great river, the Anduin, and vanished. For Isildur was marching north along the east banks of the river, and near the Gladden fields he was waylaid by the orcs of the mountains, and almost all his folk were slain. He leaped into the waters, but the ring slipped from his finger as he swam, and then the orcs saw him and killed him with arrows. Gandalf paused, and there, in the dark pools among the Gladden fields, he said, the ring passed out of all knowledge and legend, and even so much of its history is known now only to a few, and the council of the wise could discover no more. But at last I can carry on the story, I think. Long after, but still very long ago, this is like many, many centuries, maybe 1,000 years.
Proto-hobbits.
Yeah. There lived by the banks of the great river, on the edge of Wilderland, a clever-handed and quiet-footed little people. I guess they were of hobbit kind, akin to the fathers of the Stoors, for they loved the river and often swam in it, or made little boats of reeds. There was among them a family of high repute, for it was large and wealthier than most, and it was ruled by a grandmother of the folk, stern and wise in old lore, such as they had. And the most inquisitive and curious-minded of that family was called Smeagol. He was interested in roots and beginnings. He dived into deep pools. He burrowed under trees and growing plants. He tunneled into green mounds, and he ceased to look up at the hilltops or on the leaves of trees or on the flowers opening in the air. His head and eyes were always downward. He had a friend called Deagol, of a similar sort, sharper-eyed, but not so quick and strong. On a time they took a boat and went down to the Gladden fields. There were great beds of iris and flowering reeds. There Smeagol got out and went nosing about the banks. Deagol sat in the boat and fished. Suddenly a great fish took his hook, and before he knew where he was dragged out down into the water to the bottom. There he let go of his line, for he saw something shining in the riverbed. Holding his breath, he grabbed at it. Then he came up spluttering, with weeds in his hair and a handful of mud, and he swam to the bank. And behold, when he washed the mud away, there in his hand lay a golden, beautiful ring, and it shone and glittered in the sun, so that his heart was glad. But Smeagol had been watching him from behind a tree, and as Deagol gloated over the ring, Smeagol came softly up behind.
"Give us that, Deagol, my love," said Smeagol over his friend's shoulder. "Why?" said Deagol. "Because it's my birthday, my love, and I want it," said Smeagol. "I don't care," said Deagol. "I've given you a present already, more than I could afford. I found this, and I'm going to keep it." "Oh, are you indeed, my love?" said Smeagol, and he caught Deagol by the throat and strangled him, because the gold looked so bright and beautiful, and he put the ring on his finger.
No one ever found out what became of Deagol, but he was murdered far from home. His body was cunningly hidden. But Smeagol returned alone, and he found that none of his family could see him when he was wearing the ring. He was very pleased with his discovery, and he concealed it, and he used it to find out secrets, and he put his knowledge to crooked and malicious uses. He became sharp-eyed and keen-eared for all that was hurtful. This ring had given him power according to his stature. It is not to be wondered that he became unpopular and was shunned, when visible, by his relations. They kicked him, and he bit their feet. He took to thieving and going about muttering to himself and gurgling in his throat. So they called him Gollum and cursed him, and told him to go far away, and his grandmother, desiring peace, expelled him from the family and turned him out of her hole. He wandered in loneliness, weeping for a little for the hardness of the world, and he journeyed up the river till he came to a stream that flowed down from the mountains, and he went that way. He caught fish in deep pools with invisible fingers and ate them raw. One day it was very hot, and as he was bending over a pool, he felt a burning on the back of his head, and a dazzling light from the water pained his wet eyes. He wondered at it, for he'd almost forgotten about the sun. Then, for the last time, he looked up and shook his fists at her. But as he lowered his eyes, he saw from far above the tops of the misty mountains out of which the stream came, and he thought suddenly,
"It would be cold and shady under those mountains. The sun cannot reach me there. The roots of those mountains must be roots indeed. There must be great secrets buried there which have not been discovered since the beginning."
So he journeyed up by night into the highlands, and he found a little cave out of which the dark stream ran, and he wormed his way like a maggot into the heart of the hills and vanished out of all knowledge. The ring went into the shadows with him, and even the Maker, when his power had begun to grow again, could learn nothing of it. Oh my God, what a story!
Perfect.
What a story. Smeagol starts out as a sympathetic character. He's just a little hobbit guy, but he gets turned bad by the ring. Because Sauron lives in the ring, or a lot of Sauron is in the ring.
But it happens almost immediately. As soon as he sees it, he takes them over. He
Very quick. Very quick. Didn't happen to Bilbo, did it? Or Frodo. They didn't get turned so bad so quickly.
Huh? And even Deagol didn't, because he was being honest. He showed him the ring. He wasn't hiding it. But I always get the feeling that the ring knows who it's supposed to go to, because it makes choices.
Oh, that's true. It has a little bit of intent, so it sort of...
Because it wants to get back to the Master, and it could have read that Deagol was too nice.
I mean, the ring made itself get away from Gollum. It just didn't get expected to be picked up by...
It kind of miscalculated because it got buried in the mountains for centuries.
Yeah.
But then yes, because when Bilbo found it, it was very clear that it kind of trickled towards him, or it made itself known to him to get out of there.
Yeah, I believe it tells you the ring made a decision, or the ring made itself visible in the box.
Something like that.
When he's going and digging through. Well, that was amazing. Okay, say goodnight.
That was an amazing chapter. Thank you for reading and letting us.
Oh, yes.
Good night, Cameron.
Good night. We'll see you next time.
Okay. Don't forget to stop.
Thanks for being here.
Oh, it was amazing. We're glad. Okay. Do you have
all right. That is page 53. Middle of the Shadow of the Past. I'm going to stop. 48 minutes. Boom.